The applause that echoed through the Economic Club of New York on this afternoon of May 30th, 2026, was not just a polite gesture for a visiting dignitary. It was a calculated acknowledgement from the very heart of global finance that the geopolitical tectonic plates have officially shifted. For months, the prevailing narrative across Wall Street has been dictated by one single looming variable: how neighboring economies would survive the tightening vice of unilateral American tariffs and aggressive protectionist mandates. The standard expectation was economic concession or immediate retaliation. Yet, when Mark Carney stepped to the podium, the room witnessed a profound paradigm shift in how international trade tension is mediated. Carney receives a warm reception in New York following remarks on United States-Canada relations because he completely re-engineered the terms of the conversation. Instead of presenting a vulnerable trading partner pleading for exemptions, he introduced an assertive, self-reliant economic architecture that positions Canada not as a dependent, but as an indispensable alternative for global capital. I spent the entire night dissecting every line of this 45-page transcript, and I can tell you that this was not a routine diplomatic briefing. This is a cold, strategic manifesto signaling that in an era of unpredictable hypernationalism, predictability itself has become the ultimate premium. The old framework of automatic economic alignment between Ottawa and Washington is dead. What has taken its place is a highly calculated game of chess where market stability is weaponized, and the traditional balance of power across the 49th parallel is being rewritten in real time. To understand the full gravity of what transpired at the Economic Club of New York, one must look past the diplomatic pleasantries and examine the event through the cold lens of a high-stakes geopolitical chess match. Mark Carney did not choose Ottawa or Toronto to deliver this address. He walked directly into the financial nerve center of the United States to outline Canada's new legislative and economic blueprint. The audience consisted of the very individuals who control the flow of global capital institutions that prioritize risk management, structural stability, and long-term yield over political rhetoric. Standing before this assembly, Carney framed Canada's domestic policy not as a defensive reaction to American protectionism, but as an aggressive, sovereign optimization of market conditions designed to outcompete the global order. The core of this strategy relies on a sequence of deliberate legislative actions implemented over the past 12 months. Rather than adopting a policy of economic appeasement in the face of ongoing tariff threats from Washington, the Canadian government enacted a highly competitive fiscal overhaul. This included targeted tax reductions on corporate incomes and capital gains, combined with the implementation of a policy known as the productivity superdeduction. The explicit mechanism of this deduction grants Canada the most competitive tax rate for new capital investments within the entire Group of Seven, positioning its rate at half of the Group of Seven average, and precisely 4 percentage points below that of the United States. By presenting these cold statutory realities directly to American investors, the narrative was successfully shifted away from a conversation about vulnerability and toward one of comparative advantage. Furthermore, this economic posture is backed by a massive capital deployment strategy. Carney highlighted a coordinated plan to catalyze $1 trillion of targeted investment over the next 5 years, focusing heavily on national infrastructure, advanced data systems, transportation networks, and defense. To facilitate this massive influx of capital, Canada has initiated its most comprehensive regulatory overhaul in generations, specifically designed to fast-track large-scale country-building projects by eliminating traditional bureaucratic friction. This structural modernization is paired with an aggressive expansion of global trade partnerships that intentionally broadens Canada's economic footprint outside of North America. Within the last year alone, Ottawa has secured more than 20 distinct economic and security agreements across 5 continents. This diversification is a calculated move to reduce systemic reliance on any single trading partner. By lay out these verified policy achievements, the event ceased to be a simple presentation. It became a formal declaration that Canada has fundamentally decoupled its economic ambitions from the political shifts of Washington, challenging the traditional assumption that a northern neighbor must always wait and react to the mandates of the United States. Just as the Assembly of Financial Leaders began to absorb the implications of Canada's aggressive fiscal restructuring, the narrative advanced to a critical inflection point that challenged the standard power dynamics of North American trade. The conventional wisdom across major economic capitals has long assumed that a smaller economy, when subjected to intense bilateral pressure, has no choice but to absorb the costs and adjust its internal policies to accommodate the demands of a larger neighbor. However, a closer look at the structural reality of the modern supply chain reveals an entirely different set of outcomes that function as a significant unintended consequence for the United States itself. Rather than forcing a cycle of economic contraction within Canada, the implementation of protectionist measures from Washington has instead accelerated a strategic transformation that highlights an intense mutual dependence between the two nations. The primary mechanism of this counterintuitive shift lies directly within the critical sectors of energy security and resource integration. While public rhetoric often focuses on industrial competition, the cold operational data proves that the physical infrastructure of the United States economy relies heavily on Canadian inputs to maintain its daily momentum. At this exact moment in 2026, Canada functions as the foundational guarantor of American domestic stability, providing an astonishing 99% of all United States natural gas imports, 85% of its electricity imports, and a commanding 60% of its total crude oil imports. When a massive industrial economy attempts to impose severe financial penalties or structural barriers on its single largest supplier of primary energy, the inflationary pressure does not remain north of the border. It flows directly back into American manufacturing plants, utility grids, and consumer supply chains. To illustrate this systemic vulnerability, one can look at the automotive and heavy manufacturing corridors where 70% of all Canadian exports serve as direct intermediate inputs for finished American goods, including automobiles, commercial aircraft, and specialized machinery. A primary example brought forward during the New York Assembly is the cross-border trade of aluminum, an industrial asset that effectively represents raw electricity stabilized into an ingot. The volume of Canadian aluminum exports flowing into the United States carries the energy equivalent of 10 Hoover dams. Forcing a disruption in this specific pipeline under the guise of protecting domestic industries presents American manufacturers with a deeply problematic calculation. Attempting to rebuild that immense generation capacity within the United States to replace Canadian inputs would divert vital gigawatts away from other critical national priorities, such as powering the exploding infrastructure required for artificial intelligence. The unintended consequence intensifies when analyzing the global race for resource sovereignty. As the United States seeks to insulate its advanced technological sectors from overseas geopolitical choke points, its dependency on Canadian mineral endowments becomes absolute. By securing 56 critical mineral agreements with more than 10 countries over the past year, Canada has actively positioned itself as the premier, verified hub for potash, nickel, copper, uranium, lithium, and cobalt. Consequently, any prolonged economic pressure directed at Ottawa does not result in a submissive trading partner. Instead, it forces Canada to weaponize its predictability, leverage its vast resource base, and accelerate its independent trade networks. The ultimate irony of this geopolitical friction is that a strategy designed to isolate a neighbor has instead exposed the precise areas where the economic engine of the United States cannot function without Canadian cooperation. To truly understand what occurred behind the secure doors of the Economic Club of New York, one must look past the standard vocabulary of international diplomacy and decode the precise strategic signals being sent to the global markets. Politicians routinely employ terms like shared values, enduring friendship, and mutual cooperation to mask structural friction. However, the role of a structural analysis is to translate these broad pleasantries into the cold realities of capital preservation, legislative leverage, and sovereign self-interest. When the transcripts are evaluated through this analytical lens, it becomes clear that Canada's presentation was a deliberate two-pronged exercise in economic realpolitik. First, bypassing the deadlocked political institutions of Washington to communicate directly with the ultimate arbiters of American wealth, and second, establishing a disciplined fiscal framework that treats administrative predictability as a high-yield asset. The first layer of this strategy requires decoding the deliberate choice of venue. By delivering this manifesto in America's financial capital rather than a political forum, the Canadian strategy executed a classic maneuver around the flank. In the modern legislative landscape, direct trade negotiations with an administration focused on economic nationalism often yield minimal results due to domestic electoral pressures. By speaking directly to institutional fund managers, sovereign wealth entities, and multinational chief executive officers, the Canadian presentation shifted the pressure point. The message sent to these corporate entities was highly transactional. If unilateral political decisions in Washington threaten to destabilize your domestic supply chains or impose unpredictable regulatory costs, Canada has established a legally binding adjacent jurisdiction engineered specifically to shelter your capital and optimize your production. The second critical component requiring translation is the heavy emphasis placed on Canada's internal fiscal discipline. To the casual observer, announcing a 10% reduction in the federal civil service, a 20% cut in spending on external consultants, and a mandatory capping of operational expenditure growth at less than 2% sounds like standard conservative budgeting. In reality, this is a profound structural signal aimed at the global bond and infrastructure markets. At a time when the United States is managing an unprecedented federal deficit and navigating systemic debates over its statutory debt ceiling, Canada is utilizing its position as the country with the strongest fiscal standing in the Group of Seven to project absolute systemic solvency. In the language of global finance, severe sovereign debt eventually manifests as high inflation, currency volatility, or sudden tax hikes. By codifying strict expenditure controls into law, Canada is reassuring international investors that their long-term capital commitments will not be eroded by fiscal instability north of the border. Finally, we must decode the philosophical rejection of what was termed nostalgia as a strategy. This phrase represents a sophisticated critique of modern industrial protectionism. The analytical argument being made is that attempting to resurrect 20th century manufacturing ecosystems through isolationist tariff walls ignores the fundamental evolution of the global economy. Instead of competing to rebuild traditional low-margin heavy industries, the Canadian framework is deliberately tilted toward monopolizing the foundational pillars of the next industrial era: advanced artificial intelligence architecture, quantum computing research, small modular nuclear reactor deployment, and localized critical mineral refining. The strategic translation is clear. While Washington focuses on erecting defensive barriers around legacy economic sectors, Ottawa is attempting to build an open, highly integrated, and technologically superior trade network designed for the realities of the late 21st century. This is not a passive plea for the restoration of historical trade alignments. It is a calculated announcement that Canada is actively leveraging its structural predictability to attract the very capital that will define future economic dominance: The true test of any sweeping international manifesto delivered in the glass towers of Manhattan lies not in how it resonates with sovereign fund managers, but in how its structural mechanisms alter the daily lives of citizens back home. Geopolitics at the elite level operates with a high degree of abstraction, yet every shift in macro policy initiates an inevitable process of deceleration that lands directly on the domestic economy. For the average Canadian citizen, the aggressive, self-reliant stance outlined at the Economic Club of New York marks the beginning of a profound structural reorganization of the domestic labor market, consumer pricing index, and provincial resource revenue models. The strategic decision to pivot away from a posture of defensive negotiation with Washington and toward a highly competitive, independent economic ecosystem carries immediate microeconomic consequences that will redefine household balance sheets from coast to coast. The most immediate domestic friction point stems from the aggressive implementation of strict fiscal discipline designed to signal stability to international bond markets. When a government commits to cutting 10% of the federal civil service and slashing 20% of its expenditure on external consultants, the macro-level metric of an improved balance sheet conceals a sharp contraction at the micro-level. For thousands of households across major administrative hubs, this policy translates directly into immediate job losses and a reduction in public sector employment opportunities. Furthermore, the mandatory capping of operational expenditure growth at less than 2%, down from a 10-year average of over 8%, effectively puts a freeze on the expansion of local public services. Citizens will interact with a leaner state apparatus, which inevitably manifests as longer processing times for regulatory approvals, reduced administrative overhead for community infrastructure, and a heightened demand for efficiency within local institutions. Simultaneously, the massive legislative push to catalyze $1 trillion of private and public investment over the next 5 years into heavy industry, data infrastructure, and defense will trigger an abrupt reallocation of domestic labor. As capital flows into massive country-building infrastructure projects and fast-tracked energy developments, the demand for highly specialized technical and engineering labor will skyrocket. This rapid influx of capital into specific industrial corridors is highly likely to drive up localized wages within the technology, construction, and resource extraction sectors. However, for small and medium-sized enterprises operating outside these favored sectors, this creates a severe talent drain. Local businesses will find themselves forced to compete for labor against multinational consortiums backed by aggressive federal tax incentives, accelerating a polarization within the domestic job market. Finally, the aggressive acceleration of Canada's energy export infrastructure, specifically the drive to achieve nearly 50 million tons of annual liquefied natural gas exports by the end of the decade, and double that capacity in the subsequent 10 years, will fundamentally restructure local communities. For communities adjacent to major pipeline corridors and coastal shipping terminals, this industrial boom brings substantial regional investment and an expansion of the local tax base. However, as domestic energy distribution networks are heavily rerouted to service high-yield international markets, particularly across Asia, the domestic price of primary utilities faces structural upward pressure. Canadian households, despite living inside a certified energy superpower, will find their monthly electricity and heating costs increasingly tied to the volatile pricing mechanisms of global commodities. The macro strategy of using resource wealth as a geopolitical lever ultimately shifts the cost burden down to the individual consumer, transforming global trade policy into a tangible reality at the kitchen table. As this high-stakes economic realignment unfolds throughout 2026, the structural shifts initiated at the Economic Club of New York leave the future of North American trade suspended across 3 distinct geopolitical paths. The first scenario points toward a paradigm of strategic integration. In this kitsch ban, institutional investors on Wall Street, recognizing the legal stability and profound resource advantages offered by Canada, exert pressure on political structures in Washington to formalize a specialized sectoral trade alliance. This path would effectively insulate critical supply chains, specifically energy, advanced artificial intelligence infrastructure, and semiconductor-grade minerals from broader tariff disputes, preserving mutual productivity. The second, more friction-heavy scenario involves an intensification of economic nationalism. Should Washington execute absolute protectionist policies, Canada's codified fiscal hedges will be put to the ultimate test. This outcome would compel Ottawa to aggressively fast-track its diversification strategy, pivoting its sovereign capital, liquefied natural gas exports, and critical raw materials toward European and Asian manufacturing hubs. While this would inflict short-term transition shocks on domestic industries, it would ultimately accelerate Canada's long-term independence from the United States market. The third scenario introduces a complex dynamic of regulatory competition. With Canada maintaining a tax environment significantly lower than the United States and enforcing strict fiscal discipline, a quiet migration of corporate capital could materialize. Rather than a cooperative partnership, North America would see two highly competitive economic models operating side by side: an isolationist industrial superpower to the south, and a highly streamlined, resource-dominant trading network to the north. The critical question shifting forward is no longer whether economic pressure can force a policy reversal across the 49th parallel, but whether global capital will favor the scale of the United States or the absolute predictability of Canada. As an analyst reading between the lines of these legislative maneuvers, I want to hear your perspective. Will Wall Street's quest for certainty override Washington's protectionist mandates? Let me know your detailed analysis in the comments section below. If you value precise institutional-grade deconstructions of global trade, currency architecture, and international power dynamics, ensure you subscribe to Canada Today and engage the notification system. Thank you for your time, and I will see you in our next deep dive.